How will ongoing advancements in information and communication technologies, ICT, influence changes in the urban spatial structure, USS, of Perth, WA, and what policy initiatives should be considered to ensure these changes to our urban environment result in a livable city in 2050? To answer this question, we'll aim to determine what specific ICTs are anticipated to have the most significant effects, determine how these technologies can be expected to affect the spatial structure of Perth, WA, and then evaluate what policy directives should be considered to ensure Perth evolves into a livable 15-minute city. The research will show that technological changes affecting human mobility will be the greatest factor affecting urban spatial structure, and significant policy changes are needed if we're going to avoid the worsening of the suburban sprawl that began in the middle of last century. But before we look ahead, it's important to look to the past for reference. Although difficult to envisage the full impact of future innovations, a glance backwards over the past century illustrates just how extensively technology has shaped our cities, spatially, materially, and functionally. The impact has extended to all facets of modern life. A telephone connected dispersed locations and allowed for expanded settlement areas. The freedom of the motor car allowed for outward expansion into suburbia, while glass, concrete, and steel skyscrapers sent the urban centers of our cities ever higher. Technology, more than any other factor, has determined the USS we see today in our modern cities. And if the trend continues, which is all but inevitable, how will our cities evolve by the middle of this century? In 2050, the world is going to be a very different place than the one we know today. According to author Kevin Kelly, the types of changes we've seen since the advent of the internet, such as mobile phones, online shopping, modes of social interaction, the list is endless, is only going to expand and become more and more entrenched by 2050. He believes this is inevitable because these changes are rooted in the nature of technology rather than in the nature of society. He cites the example of industrial processes such as steam engines, which favor temperatures and pressures outside human comfort zones. So these technologies naturally gravitated to industrial zones outside the city, leading to a distinct separation of a city's residential and industrial spaces. With ICT technology, the bias is toward cheap, ubiquitous copies, and this is independent of nationality and culture. So it steers us toward a sort of social homogeneity. And this bias, he says, is baked into the technology. And it is for this reason that the nature of technology molds society. Now, Kelly is not alone in his reasoning. There's an emerging consensus among ICT researchers that due to its rapid advancement and increasing ubiquitousness, it will become the dominant technology influencing the USS of our cities in the coming decades. So, to answer the first part of the research question, what technologies will physically affect our urban spaces in a significant way? Because some can be expected to be immaterial, offering only simple convenience, but others can be expected to have far-reaching impacts. Now, adapting the conceptual model of Yousefi and Dadashpour 2020, we can identify three principal aspects of USS that are subject to influence by ICT. These are human activities such as work, shopping, and leisure, personal communications, phone, telephone and video calls, and transportation, both of people and goods. Now, using these three aspects to categorize current studies on the impact of technology on USS, a review of the current literature reveals the following. Now, the general effect of ICT on basic human activities such as work, shopping, and leisure is expected to result in a phenomenon known as fragmentation. Now, this is the process of activities being separated into smaller components or fragments that are then performed at different times and/or locations. For example, whereas we once needed to commute to the office to work and then drive to the shops to shop, both activities can now be done from home or while traveling practically simultaneously. Both the geographical location and the time at which these things happen or are performed are altered by ICT. Now, ICTs have provided us novel new ways to communicate. Video calls, social media, mobile phones means that we're all connected all the time. The question is to what extent the activity is substituted or complemented. Will ICT complement face-to-face interaction, or will it substitute it altogether, meaning that travel patterns and residential choices of residential location are affected and so on? Now, Yousefi and Dadishpour 2020 say the research on this is inconclusive, and Schwanner et al. 2008 notes that research outcomes that are presented as binary, in other words, either one or the other, are generally not safe. Now, where researchers vary in their findings on activities and on communications, with general uncertainty around what their ultimate effect on USS will be, recurrent themes in the literature suggest that changes in mobility due to autonomous vehicle technology replacing human-driven vehicles will have an identifiable effect on the USS of our cities, with the effects being the geographical dispersion of urban centers and employment locations, coupled with increasing urban sprawl. Now, an autonomous vehicle is a self-driving vehicle, and it's able to do this through numerous physical sensors and cameras, coupled with extremely complex computer code that acts as its brain, replacing the decision-making of the human driver. It is similar in concept to autopilot, already used in passenger airliners, but where it's different is that it is far, far more complex, and therefore is, according to various estimates, approximately, anywhere from 10 to 30 years away from maturation. Now, what makes this technology so significant is that what today is time lost in the car, commuting to work, or traveling in general, now becomes productive time. And for those who cannot or do not drive, it offers new opportunities for increased mobility. So the following case studies will illustrate how researchers have determined these factors are going to impact on the spatial structure of our cities. Now, having established what technologies are going to affect urban spatial structure, we'll now look at how that technology will impact our cities. The first case study is Melbourne, Victoria. Thakur et al. In 2016 studied the effects of autonomous vehicle technology on Melbourne's urban form by approaching the question from a cost of travel perspective. Firstly, the authors predict that autonomous vehicles will lead to a willingness to accept longer travel times because the cost of that time is reduced, as the traveler is freed up to work, sleep, converse, etc. And as a result, they may choose to live further away from commercial city centers. Then examining the ride-sharing model, today the cost of traveling by taxi is more expensive than by private vehicle, and that's because driver costs account for more than 50% of the fare. Now, with a ride-sharing model or a shared AV model, the cost is removed, that driver cost is removed, and it reduces the overall annual cost of travel well below that of private vehicle travel. Now, based on these cost models, these inputs, the authors state there'll be major impacts on infrastructure demand and urban form. They determined this by dividing Melbourne into a series of orbital zones and tested a number of scenarios with their cost models, was designed to determine the net population change for each of these zones in the coming 20 years. And what they found was that with a private AV as the dominant mode of transport, approximately 1% or 50,000 people will choose to move from the CBD to the outer zones or the outer suburbs. Conversely, if shared AVs become the dominant mode, the population shift is inverted, with the CBD and inner zones increasing in density. Now, case study number 2 was Atlanta, Georgia in the USA, where a similar modeling study was performed to the one we just saw in Melbourne. And it reached very similar results as well, and namely that the reduced cost of travel time makes people far more willing to travel further and therefore live further away from city centers, where real estate is typically cheaper, which was particularly true for those under 40 on lesser budgets. And again, as in the Melbourne study, this shared autonomous vehicle model showed that urban densification can be made more appealing with a convenient, efficient shared AV service. So in summary, where we have private AVs as the predominant model, this leads to more car travel, less public transit, and more urban sprawl. But the converse is true when we have a shared AV model becoming the predominant mode, which leads to less travel, fewer trips, and increased urban density. No studies were found to exist that model the future effect of autonomous vehicles in Perth, WA. So we begin here with a historical study of urban growth in the city and the factors that have led to its current form. Now, research by Kelobanye et al. In 2019 support our previous findings and that transport has been a major driver in the development of the city's urban form. They also cite economic development and planning frameworks as two other key factors that have influenced the spatial structure of Perth as we see it today. Now, prior to the advent of the motor car, most of Perth's development was centered around the main mode of transportation of the day, which was the Swan River. So most of the population was clustered along the river's edge between Perth and Fremantle, and we can see that in the maps on the screen. However, the introduction of private vehicles allowed for convenient settlement away from the Swan along the coast, making accessible the huge swathes of land that stretch north and south along the city's beautiful Indian Ocean coastline. The authors cite 180 kilometers of heavy passenger rail and freeways laid out like red carpets to welcome the automobile that have greatly aided the rapid dispersed suburbanization, making Perth one of the most sprawling cities in the world. Now, referencing the gold rushes of the 19th century and the recent mining booms of 2003 to 2013, they show that this economic activity coincides with the expanding urban settlement of the city. Now, if we assume that AVs will influence urban form as the case studies have predicted, and that Perth remains a prosperous economic center in the coming decades, as we hope it will, it's entirely logical to assume that Perth's suburban sprawl is going to continue to expand ever further along the coast unless policy is designed and implemented to force a different outcome. So we've established what technology is going to impact our cities, and we've also established how we expect it to affect the form of our cities. So now we ask the question, what should we do about it? Now, as architects, we're taught concepts of livable communities such as connectedness, sustainability, walkability, with the aim of achieving a higher quality of life for our built environments. Now, most recently, these concepts have coalesced under the banner of the 15-minute city, which is a polycentric model where multiple connected cores, city cores, or community cores, coexist within a broader metropolitan region. Now, under this model, residents have access to all the basic essentials within a 15-minute walk or bike ride to or from their home. Now, the originator of the idea, Carlos Moreno, states that the quality of urban life, is inversely proportional to the amount of time invested in the automobile. So as the research has shown, adoption of the shared model of AV use will be critical to limiting the continuation of dispersed development. However, this outcome represents a paradigm shift both in notions of personal transport and of vehicle ownership. So is it feasible? Examining future scenarios of AV use in Sydney, New South Wales, researcher Jennifer Kent notes how culturally attached Australians are to the notion of private car ownership. And she notes activities such as listening to music, private phone calls, a secure family space. All of these would not be possible in shared cars, and she asserts that we won't readily give up on this convenience in favor of some sort of a collective socialist ownership and ride-sharing model, irrespective of the economic incentives, which are significant, as can be shown in the graph there on the page. Now, while technological advocates like Kevin Kelly in 2016 ensure us that the concept of widespread shared technological resources are inevitable, he does not investigate any specifics with respect to the likelihood of sharing as it applies to physical vehicles. Likewise, Lippmann's 2021 in-depth study into the future predictions for AV use in Victoria, he doesn't predict the likelihood of the acceptance of the shared model. However, he does conclude that to cause this paradigm shift that we need to create polycentric urban communities aligned to this 15-minute city concept, the shift from private to shared vehicles is going to be necessary. He states that planners must anticipate how new technologies and services are likely to affect road, parking, and public transit needs. Now, we noted previously the contribution of Perth's transport infrastructure to urban sprawl. In 2012, 716,000 people, or 81% of commuters, regularly commuted to work by private car, which is higher than the national average of 78%. One of the major contributing factors that leads to this level of dependence on the car and resultant sprawl is our individual false perception of the costs of commuting, according to Bruckner, 2000. Because the costs of increased road congestion are largely borne by others in the form of their delays, The cost of commuting appears artificially cheap, and the individual has minimal incentive to take this cost into account, according to Bruckner. Now, he believes economic measures are the most effective method in raising driver awareness and suggests congestion tolling to be effective. Now, although writing over 20 years ago, in 2000, Bruckner had the foresight to recognize that technological advances will allow for the efficient collection of tolls, i.e. no toll booths that don't impede traffic, and also allow for the pricing to be adjusted in line with the degree of congestion, allowing, for example, for the prioritization of certain routes. And public transport was also noted as a factor in Perth sprawl by Calabonnier et al. 2019. Put simply, building rail lines is costly, complicated, and time-consuming, and in Perth the lines have not kept up with urban expansion and given residents little option but to drive, which is illustrated on the map with the large red circled areas not being serviced directly by rail. Now, according to Fielbaum, 2019, if existing traditional public transport, such as rail, is to remain viable, it must adapt to the broader set of changes that AV adoption will bring. And he notes that if this isn't done effectively, passengers will simply opt for the convenience of new AV technology, which will then lead to a decline in traditional fixed bus and rail usage. However, encouragingly, autonomous public transport vehicle trials are already underway in Perth, so we can see that the transition has already started. Now, these policy examples are just several of those that could be considered. There will be many others that should be considered as the technologies mature and assumptions and uncertainties give way to real-world learning. So in conclusion, what we've learned throughout from this investigation is that to promote the best possible outcome in terms of our 15-minute livable city, we need to do a few things. We need to promote the shared model for autonomous vehicles and discourage as much as possible ongoing and increased private ownership. We need to augment existing public transport with AVs to make them convenient, efficient, and accessible to all sections of the city and all communities. We should also price private vehicle trips and routes such that congestion is eased and preferable routes are prioritized. And we also want to use the flexibility of AV transit to promote density in our urban cores. Thank you very much.